This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, I am delighted to bring you something a little bit different. We've got 5 authors gathered, myself included, to talk about women's fiction. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves so that you get to associate the voice with the name and the title. I thought that might be helpful. So, Amanda, you're up.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. So, my name is Amanda Speights, and I write romantic, historical women's fiction with a touch of spice. And my book, Love's Arrival, is out now. It's my debut novel.
Excellent. Thank you. Dee, over to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dee Liebhart, and I write stories about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Same thing in women's fiction, and my debut novel, House on Fire, which I do not have a copy to hold up. It has been out for a year, and I have another novel coming out in just a couple months.
Excellent. Heidi?
Okay, I'm Heidi McIntyre, and my debut novel is Sea Magic, and it came out last February 2023, and I write magical stories with endearing characters. So I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you. Jen, your turn.
Hi, I'm Jen Telger, and excited to be here. I think this is a neat format. My debut novel is What Heals the Heart. This happens to be a not-for-resale author's copy. And it's part of a series that follows up with book 2, Sticks and Stones. And I write intergenerational friendship novels that focus on the dynamic between different generations and how they help each other and how the lessons are passed from one to the other and sometimes from the front backward. So I like to write relatable characters that everybody can identify as got that person in our town.
Fantastic. All right. And then there's me. I am Alida Winternheimer. I write tales of complicated women and the past that haunt them. My new release, actually a re-release, so if you've been listening to the show for a while, you've heard me mention it over the years. But my new re-release is A Stone's Throw, a second edition, in which 2 women who never meet, a motherless child and a childless mother, are brought together to discover the real magic of creation. So that's my new cover. This will be coming out in June. So we thought it would be great to get together because Women's Fiction Day is June 8th, and we're celebrating, doing some book promotions, and it's a perfect time to talk about women's fiction. So we're all women. We're writing stories with female protagonists that are being categorized, put in a marketing category for women. But is there more to being women's fiction than that? Let's talk about what this is.
But kind of an interesting thing that I found out from one of the bookstores that I sell my books in. And she told me that, interestingly enough, there's an entire group or demographic of men that read only women's fiction. And so it brought up an interesting question of, with women's fiction, we talk about the emotional journey rather than, say, a romantic journey or something like that. And one of the questions that we were discussing amongst some other authors and I as well was, does the gender of the protagonist need to necessarily be female if that emotional journey is there and there are supporting characters as part of the story who are female? And I thought it very interesting that there would be a group who, traditionally were not writing to, that find that emotional piece of a story that's so key to any story that you tell, that they would be drawn to that and go back and continue to seek that out. I thought that spoke really well to, while we're somewhat of a like a subgenre, it's also very broad in appeal.
It is, and you went deep right away, because one of the things I wanted to talk about later was this idea of readers. And if we're put into the category of women's fiction, are we being cut off from male readers? And then, there's the question of, well, if a man writes a story about relationships with an emotional journey, it's literature. But if a woman writes that same story, it's women's fiction. So since that's already on the table, I'd love to hear what the rest of us think about these issues around women's fiction as a category and, what kind of protagonists we have, the emotional journey, and who our readers are.
I think women's fiction is sort of a way of signaling to other women that this is a strong female protagonist. It doesn't mean that there are not men in the story or men that are key and also can be main characters too. But I really think it's centered around the emotional journey of the woman, and as typically a strong protagonist that sort of signals to other women that this is what this is. And I think that's why it's sort of becoming so much more popular. But I think some of the issues with women's fiction is it's very broad, and with other genres are more narrow, so they're more easily defined. But we have a lot of subgenres within women's fiction, and sometimes that can be confusing for people too. Like my book is also paranormal women's fiction, for example, and there's mystery and thriller. There's romance. There's so many pieces and parts to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to talk about that, the way women's fiction is a broad category that crosses more genres. But first, um, Dee or Amanda, how do you define women's fiction and think about your readership?
Yeah, so the first thing that crossed my mind is women's fiction is about strong female characters. That doesn't just put it into this little box, though. And I think some people don't understand that. I had someone say, when I was talking about my book, because it is historical romance and there is spice, and she was saying, yeah, but my book is women's fiction. I said, yes, but my book is women's fiction also. My protagonist is a strong female character. The book is about her journey of learning her self-worth, but it's also a romance. It's also spicy. And so I think that a lot of people just don't completely understand what that means.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think my dilemma, because I'm not a huge fan actually of the term women's fiction, and I think for a couple reasons. One is I think we did it for a particular reason, right? And I think there's no arguing that men don't read books that have that are written by women. And then so that's like a statistical fact. Like that's something. There's lots of articles that have been written about that, and I don't think that has to do with us identifying ourselves as like, oh, this is women's fiction, and it's putting them off. It's almost the opposite. This was our response to that already happening. So that was what was happening, and now we're saying like, hey, like maybe like Heidi was saying like, hey, this is us. Like this is who this is for. Like I don't actually need you guys to read my book. I mean, yeah, fine, you want to, great, but I don't actually need you because women are the biggest buyers of books out there. And so I think it was kind of a way of signaling of like, hey, this is for you. This is stepping out of this other mainstream thing that we want to call that academia calls literature. This is the real literature. And we're like saying, hey, you can read this other book. So I think it's like that double-edged sword, like where it was a thing that we were doing to kind of separate ourselves to be like, hey, here it is. And then at the same time, I think it's become something of a negative because I don't actually consider my book meets all the definitions that you go by, but I consider my book just contemporary fiction. And I don't know that you would call somebody like Jodi Picoult necessarily women's fiction, but it meets that definition. So I think it's got that two sides of the positive and the negative. And I think that certainly as women, we definitely live in a world where, men get a lot more attention for that literature thing. It's a lot more, and I think you can say it's not only women, it's also people of color, people from different backgrounds. It's a world that has been controlled by a certain group of people for a very long time, and that's what's influenced it. And I think I said "hey" about 20 times in that.
If you did, I didn't even notice. Yeah. That's such an interesting point. I didn't call my book women's fiction when I was writing it, or even the first time I published it. I considered it contemporary fiction. And when I write my other stories, I consider ghost story murder mysteries. And I don't know if everyone here at the table feels the same way, but the point you raise has me wondering, did we all set out to write women's fiction or choose to be in this category of literature? Or is it a category that we kind of fell into because when you set up your book for sales, that's where you end up?
I think it's interesting because you rarely find a women's fiction author who only writes in a single genre. For example, my books, my first one called What Heals the Heart, I thought, okay, people are going to think it's a romance. And oddly, they don't. And it's not a romance. There are romantic aspects to it, but it also pulls in friendships, and it pulls in historical fiction and contemporary fiction. It pulls in so many different things. And to me, that is one of the hallmarks of women's fiction, is that it does pull from different genres. And that kind of all goes into the pot to become that emotional journey. So I think initially we started out saying, okay, we want to identify so that people know, hey, this is about strong female protagonists. Mm-hmm. But I think society has a hard time associating a gender word with anything other than a pigeonhole. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's women's fiction. We're identifying something, just like a cover of a book identifies, you will like this. Mm-hmm. But people interpret the title deeper than it is, because so many women's fiction writers pull from, like you said, mystery or thriller or, all different kinds of things. So I think I agree with Dee that we tried to do something really good there, but I think it does sometimes kind of stutter what we're trying to do. I frequently have to explain to people. They say, well, what's women's fiction? You write romance stories? Not as a genre, no. And then I have to explain. So I think if there was a better way to let people know what it is, then we could start pulling in all these other pieces, and they say, wow, there's really a lot in there for me to read. A lot that could appeal to me in a lot of different genres.
Yeah, that's my biggest concern about women's fiction is I don't know that the average reader knows what that means, or knows what that is. And I think that's why I too spend a lot of time explaining what women's fiction is and what it means. And my book has a mashup of genres. I've got paranormal, I've got historical, and magical realism all in there. And so it's a collective of genres, but I think that's also what gives it its strength is we can pull from different resources and pull a lot of things together. And I started out, my very first book that I wrote, which will still be in the drawer, was a historical romance novel. And when I sent the first draft to the editor, she looked at it and she was like, well, this is not, romance. You're too busy dealing with all these relationships that the character has. And at the time, I didn't connect that to women's fiction. But when I decided not to publish that novel and I went to write the next one, I realized, oh, that's women's fiction. Yay, that's what I want to do, because I want to talk about her emotional journey and her relationships with her family and friends and community. And so I think that's a big part of women's fiction is the relationship aspect and the emotional journey.
Mm-hmm. I think those two things can be a very fine line. You can have romance and you can in women's fiction, and you can have, even a romance be part of their emotional journey, whatever happens in their romance. But I think we also get a lot of liberty in, hey, we can pull in a lot of different things and whatever we want it to be. It's a deep genre. It really is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you meet somebody and say, I write X, Dee says contemporary fiction.
Say I write books. Like
I write books. What kind of books do you write? Because I've heard several times mention of I have to educate people about what women's fiction is. So why not just bypass that term and say, this is a story about, magical realism and whatever. It's got these kinds of storylines or this kind of a journey. Amanda, do you self-identify as a women's fiction author?
Yeah, typically I identify as a historical romance author. I will add in the women's fiction for those who know what it is, and they instantly will know that I have a strong female character. But for those who don't know, that's why I like to say I write romantic historical fiction, because just like going back to the other author that I was talking to who said, I write women's fiction and I'm having a hard time with marketing this book. And I had suggested that she market it as whatever her other the subgenres are for her book. And she said, well, I'll have to think about that. I don't know. So, but for people that don't know what women's fiction is, I mean, I feel like you have to tell them more.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. So I've heard it's about the emotional journey, relationships, and then also strong female protagonists. Is there anything else that defines women's fiction? Are those three the main items we would point to?
I mean, I tend to, get really reductionist. Is like if I've got a female protagonist, I would consider it probably women's fiction, just because that's kind of the defining feature of what to me makes it about a woman's journey, a woman's life, it's like that focusing on that woman as the central theme. So for me, that's how I would personally, identify it, is that's it. If it's a story about a woman in all of our different areas, all of our different worlds, all of our different things that we do, one of the things that one of the compliments and negatives I get about House on Fire is like, well, there's so much else going on. And you're like, have you ever been in real life? Like, have you ever been with a woman who's a mother and has a job and has relationships and has elderly parents and all of those things? That's what I think you're trying to capture, is like, to me, it's more about like this true experience of all those things that women, go through. So I think I don't know that we define it well. And I don't know. I think the reason we can't define it well is because it's not one thing. It's not something that's simple or clear, like, oh, it's a mystery. Okay, this is what's going to happen. It's not really a genre in that regard. It's more of, like I said, I think it's more of an alert. This is who this book is for, as opposed to this is what this book is about.
Yeah, I like what you said about the woman being at the center of the story and the woman's experience, because that definition is all encompassing of everything else that we've touched on here, whether it's genre related or just specific to the story, the themes, the, issues and circumstances we're setting up our characters to face. Yeah, I think somebody else was, go.
One thing that I get similar, and that people will say to me, what I love is just your characters are so relatable because they go through those things that you just, oh, I can't believe I'm having to do this again, but they are real life. And if you want to get into an escapism book, you get into an escapism book, and you know that that's what you're getting into. But if you want to get into something that, tease you up for, hey, you're still doing a great job, or you know what, you're not alone, or you can do this, you can get through it. Look at it in this perspective. That's, I think, the market that we serve. And I think it's not a market that's necessarily promoted for its realism. But I say a lot of the authors that I've talked to said people just really like that they're real, relatable characters. And I think sometimes readers are misunderstood in terms of what they want for a specific genre, and what they're looking for. Okay, if you want romance, fine, read a romance book. But if you don't, okay, what are you looking for? And I frequently find that it's very character driven.
Yeah, I love that. And that explains what you said at the beginning about the bookseller telling you that there are men who specifically read women's fiction. And I also love that that gives us a way to think about why one book might be a romance and another book that has a strong romantic theme would be women's fiction because of all of the other things, immediate to the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what Jen said about relatable is really key because I do think that that's what another thing that women's fiction does is it's very relatable in addition to all the other things that we talked about. But I also feel like it's an empowering journey too. I think there's a transformative element. It doesn't have to be, but I feel like a lot of the women's fiction that I read and that I write has more of an empowering story about the female protagonist.
Yeah, I agree. And when someone walks away from reading my book, my hope is that they will realize their own worth. So, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's sort of like building self-confidence. Like in my character, she learns to become more confident as the book progresses in herself and in her abilities.
And while she may be fiction, the situation necessarily isn't.
Yeah.
Her situation isn't necessarily something that you only find in novels. It's something that people really go through. I get interaction from people saying, when I do ads, I'm going through this right now. And a lot of people have reached out and said that. My book deals with two older women who have been friends for years, and they have a falling out, and they don't exactly know why. And I have women reach out to me saying, this happened to me. My best friend has walked away, and I don't know why, and I'm so upset. And so it gives them something to go to say, man, this does happen. And it really comes to that confidence piece. I think, like Heidi said, it builds that up.
And I think that one of the things I love that Jen was saying that about like this particular relationship, right? Because and I have a real beef with literature. So just because I do think there's been this like historical way of looking that the only relevant stories are about men or about like sophisticated things and stuff like that. And there's been this really not observational looking at this kind of thing, like the relationship between two elderly or older women, and that breaking and coming back together. That's like a valid thing that people experience. And yet it's very unlikely to have been a story that, Ernest Hemingway would have written, because there was no war in it and there was no, bullfighting and things like that. And so I do think that that's definitely, and I think, Jennifer Weiner is pretty famous for taking Jonathan Franzen, I can never say his name, to task for that idea that the world of women is not a relevant thing to talk about, that we're not allowed to talk about those things and those experiences and have them have meaning for a wider audience. And the question, of course, is like, why not? Like, why is half the world women and yet our stories are not as relevant about like how I'm juggling this job and taking care of my kids and things like that? Why is that not more, as relevant as, your job as an ad exec or whatever? I was trying to pick some book out of a hat, but that's what one of my big beefs is like that I read everything. Like, and I very rarely actually probably pick women's fiction as like a target. That's not like what draws me to a book. It is someone, I don't read reviews. I don't do anything. It's someone told me this is a great book. That's it. I'm like, don't tell me anything about it. And then I'll go read it. And that's how I find books, because I don't go in with a preconceived notion. I'm not looking for a particular kind of book. And I think that our dilemma is that we've been told for so long that these stories are not, they're not literature, and yet they are. Of course they're literature. That's exactly what they are, but we've had to separate ourselves out to like sort of like wave our flag, you know. Ooh, I'm sounding like very militant here, aren't I?
We're not used to being validated all the time.
Yeah.
You know, we're not used to having that. And I know it particularly, well, for me, when I write and I pull in the historical fiction pieces, what they've been through even before the story starts is important. You know, and whether it be they've gone through a war or, you know, lost a sibling or, you know, whatever happened in their younger life, they've gotten through that. And that is part of what makes them who they are today. And I find a need to validate women going, hey, you've been through some stuff and that's okay. And you're coming out stronger for it. And I think our characters validate that. I think women crave that because we haven't had that much.
Yeah. And I also feel like we're staking our claim, you know, about women, you know, writing about women, or we're writing about empowering women and transformational and all those things. It's sort of like us saying that we do have stories to tell. We do have journeys to take, and it is valid to have a strong woman protagonist going through her journey. And for me, it's not really about whether people perceive it as literature or not. It's how the readers perceive it. Because if I get reviews that say I learned something, or that was very helpful for me to read, or I got something significant out of it, that's really what it's about for me. Is I want to educate and inspire and entertain. You know, so if I've done those things, I feel like I've done my job. And whatever it's perceived as, for me, that's the reward that I get, is getting those reviews and getting personal emails from readers who talk about what they got out of the book.
Yeah, I agree completely. I had someone who was going through a divorce, and she read my book, and then she private messaged me and said, "You have given me so much hope through this story." And that was just like, I'm done. I'm done. I did my job here.
So do we end up segmented by this category and cut off from male readers? As I'm listening to this conversation and how important it is that our stories be told and that our stories are present in the world and validated, I'm thinking, yes, and it's important that our stories aren't only told to women, you know, but if you go online and you look at women's fiction as a category at retailers, I look at the cover art and what's trending and all of the floral designs, and I think, why would a male reader look at that thumbnail and click on it? Why would this story, which does have a male point of view, it's 3 points of view, but it's, you know, 2 female protagonists, but I do have a male point of view character, and I've had men read it and respond to me that they enjoyed it. But then if we're put in these categories, do we lose that opportunity of communicating with male readers?
Kind of interesting that you mentioned that, because when I first did my first cover, and I do have it sitting here. So this is actually the original cover for the first book in my series. Now,
Or
this
what
is
the
not
heart heals. What heals the heart.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So it's probably backwards for you, but this is not as traditionally on point for genre as this one is. This one, for me, as the writer, and I got a lot of comments from people saying, I picked this book up because of the cover, not because they thought it was women's fiction, but because of how it made them feel. And you always hear, it comes down to colors and fonts and expectations, and they need to see that cover and know exactly what they're going to get. But I think that's hard to do with women's fiction. It's hard to do a cover for women's fiction because of that expectation. There's so many different expectations that could be there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I see it as niching down, if you will. We niche down, and if we happen to grab those male readers, all the better. But yeah, that's just how I see it.
Right. Yes, we can't appeal to everybody.
Yeah.
Can we? Yeah. So let's shift our focus out of genre a bit and talk about what happens within the story. Let's talk about our female protagonists, what goes into making them and what makes them special. Dee, I'm going to call on you because you already pointed out that your protagonist is a real person. She's lifelike. She isn't just dealing with the matters of the main plot line, which is her father's dementia, but she's also dealing with her career and her son and her best friend and her, romantic partner and such. So I'm going to let you speak into this first.
Wow. So repeat the question again.
Well,
That's a lot of pressure there.
That idea of the strong female protagonist and what we're doing when we write these heroes or heroines, or I don't know, is it taboo to say heroine anymore, to feminize an noun?
Well, and I think I definitely tend towards writing what probably most people would consider less likable females, and I have another pet peeve about that. So I don't feel like main characters have to be someone that is appealing, that you would like to hang out with. And I think what I'm always striving for is someone who's real, who seems real in all their flaws. And those are kind of my favorite. Amanda was talking about getting that feedback from your audience. I think probably my favorite comment that someone's made about House on Fire is that it's achingly real, like it's painfully real. And I think I guess that's what I'm going for, is because we do find ourselves in these situations that are complex. And I personally hate when this resolution is this simple thing. Is like, oh, this is just so obvious. Just do that. And you're like, yeah, no, that's not how life is. There's always this could work, or this could work, or maybe I should do this, but I really don't know. And like, if I knew the future, maybe I would know. But we're really dealing with those, complex issues. So I think that for me, it's less about strong than it is about real. Someone facing real issues in a real way, and taking those issues seriously and not making light of them. That's I would say, for me, that's more of what that female protagonist is about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Heidi.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Mine, I think my character is flawed, and I think that's part of the emotional journey. Is she starts out, she owns an antique shop on the coast of New England, and she has these psychic abilities where she can touch an object and feel the essence of the previous person who owned that object. But she's in denial about it, and she's very much a loner, and all the people around her are trying to get her to get out and do more, and she's a workaholic. So she has all these like sort of flaws within her, and she's sort of struggling. And then when she buys a box at an estate sale, and she starts dreaming about a woman from the 18th century, all of a sudden she's confronted with having to admit that she has certain psychic abilities and that she can, do certain things. And it sort of forces her out of her shell and pushes her out into the world. And then that's when she meets that's the romantic element. She meets a handsome history professor who helps her on her journey. But it's really about her sort of being taking life as being small and then growing and empowering, and her world gets bigger and bigger and her connections get more broad. And then at the end, she really realizes that she needs to be her true, authentic self. And I think that sort of classic women's fiction for me is a flawed character going through a very emotional journey. And at the end, there's a huge learning curve. And then there's growth in the process.
Nice. Give us your title again, Heidi.
It's Sea Magic, and you can see her on the cover. She's underwater.
Beautiful.
And it's definitely not the poppy flowery book that,
No.
it sort of speaks to paranormal magical realism.
It does. Yes. Beautiful. Amanda, you were starting to say something.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Dee was saying, that it's about real life and being real. And I actually read her book, and I found that character to be very real. And I actually liked her personally. I wouldn't mind hanging out with her myself. But yeah, and going back to the question you had originally asked, what goes into this character, for me, my character was told that she wasn't good enough. She wasn't fortunate enough, and she wasn't worthy enough. Well, that was my childhood. I was told I'd never be anything. I would I would just be a nobody. And I was able to grow from that and realize that I was allowing those people, those adults in my life, to project their own feelings on me. And so that's what my character learns in her story, that it was never even about her.
Nice. And give us your title too.
Mine is Love's Arrival.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, I just know there are listeners who are hearing these tidbits and going, oh, I would love that book. So throw the title out there. Yeah. Jen, what about you? What do you think goes into your protagonist?
I think when I first started writing the first book, I did not realize I was writing women's fiction. I didn't know what I was writing. I just needed to get these characters out of my head. And one of the things I struggled with was, like Dee said with her book, I have an unlikable hero. She is not someone that you want to go knock on her door and hang out with for the afternoon. But she's also gone through so much. And I think as women, we're often told, to smile more or, all this. Part of what's important to me is that, yes, it's a strong protagonist, a strong female, but she's not always strong, and sometimes she falls apart. And sometimes she makes huge mistakes. And part of her journey, a good portion of her journey, is realizing, listen, all this happened to me. I didn't fall apart through this. I did fall apart through that, and both are okay. It's okay to fall apart. It's okay to be a mess. It's okay to have life be really messy and need to apologize and have to own things. But coming through that, realizing those things and working on those things is where she gains her power. That's really what makes her who she is. And one of the things that I always wonder about stories, once I publish a book, I don't feel like it's mine anymore. Because every reader comes to it with their own lens of what they've been through. So I almost feel like it's a book of story starters, because every person who reads it will find something different. And I was at a book club last year, and somebody came up to me afterwards and she said, our club read a book last year, and she had recently lost her husband. And she said, everybody loved this book. They thought it was so funny and so great. And she looked at me, she said, Jen, I'm the only one that realized it was about grief. And I just thought that was such a powerful thing, because it really made me realize everybody reads every story differently. So I like to pull as many aspects about a woman as I can, so that everybody can find a bit of themselves in her, in whatever form that takes. and then come out stronger for it.
Mm.
So that's kind of what goes into it for me is, and part of that comes from things that I've had to go through. You could say, hey, listen, are you going to pick your stuff up or are you going to crawl under the rug? And that's not an easy place to be, but it's an okay
Right.
place to be.
Right.
Just don't stay there.
Definitely. Do our protagonists start with us in the sense of write about what you know, drawing from our own life experiences, drawing from perhaps our own core wounds that we've recognized and have been grappling with through our lives and such? I'd like to dig into that a little bit and think about how our experiences living women informs what we write into our female characters.
Yeah, mine definitely does. Mine definitely pulls upon my experiences. And I think that's why I became more passionate about writing this second book, was it felt like a reflection of me more and what I love to read about and what, like things that experiences that I want to tell, those stories that, I love those themes. And so, but there's a lot of me, and of course in our books and in many of our characters. But I also have a historical character, Maria, from the 18th century, that was very different. And I think Amanda can probably relate to this, when you're writing about someone in a different time period, their whole reality is different. And sort of you almost have to step into that world and understand that. And I was really fearful about writing her story. And then, but when I was able to, you have to do a ton of research in order to really get that right. But when I was able to do that, I thought, she's so different from me, but she has this arc and she has this emotional journey and she has this story, and I want to tell it. And she was actually a real person. She actually was a real historical person. So that I felt like that sense of responsibility to tell her story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
like
like I had said, my character basically evolved from me. And what I went through as a child and what I've gone through as an adult. I lost my first husband. My character loses her husband, although it's a completely different situation, completely different marriage. And I have since remarried. And so my character is, ends up finding love again. And so, yes, a lot of bits and pieces of what I have gone through in life has gone into this book. And I actually, for me, it's a different time period, but I think we're still women and we still have to go through those same situations, whether we're living in the 1800s or the 1900s or the 1500s. If a husband is abusive, he's abusive, right? And if we lose a child, we lose a child. It's the same kind of pain. And so that's what I had discovered writing my story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I did something, I guess I was going to say similar, but then I'm like, probably similar to everybody. But also, I'll just say I also drew on my own experience and took my experience of pregnancy loss, caused by non-viable birth defects, and then I gave it to one of my two protagonists in this story, but then it's fictionalized. So her experience is nothing like mine, except that, I knew what this was because I'd been through it. And then I think when I was writing it originally in the drafting process, when it was still kind of raw and in that flowing through you stage, it was like I was able to, through her and through the vehicle of fiction, create an emotional experience that was like my emotional experience, even though it was sort of magnified. It was blown way up from what I went through into stuff I could do in story. Right. So I don't know. I don't know if anyone has had a kind of a similar experience drawing from your own life. And then when you do that transformation into fiction, I don't know, just throwing that out there.
Yeah, a lot of us find catharsis in our writing, you know. And I like what Heidi said about there's a responsibility to your characters and to tell a story, not necessarily correctly, but appropriately. And I ran into that a lot with the second book. And again, it's in the same series, but each series has a different protagonist, or each book in the series has a different protagonist, while still within the same community. And in the second book, the kids in the story encounter the first Black student in their district. And the story isn't told from the Black student's perspective, it's told from the white kids. And we've never seen this before. But there was a big responsibility that I felt to, hey, I can get this right. I'm writing it from the perspective of the white kids. But there are people I need to consult to make sure that I am doing my due diligence on this boy who came into the district and how he made his friends and that kind of thing. So I think there is just a ton of responsibility to our characters to treat them as real people, to treat them as, yeah, you're fiction, but you are very much a real person. And I know for me, I pull some from my own experience, but I pull so much from what I've learned from what others have gone through. And I'm a people watcher. And it's fascinating for me to see somebody go through a dark period and come out and see what they've learned and how they apply it. You know, and that's just, to me, that responsibility, that's just such a key word to making believable characters.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And my book takes place in an antique store, and I grew up with antique stores. My grandmother had one, and my great aunts and uncles all had antique shops. And so that I was really immersed in that world as a kid, and it was fun for me to create that. And my main character has that passion for antiques, but she also has certain personality traits that I relate to, or that I can see some of her flaws, you know, or things that I've struggled with. And it's fun to be able to put that in and to create a world based on my past experiences and what I know, and make that something else, you know, and make that a little magical, or make that, you know, unique in its own. So, and
the protagonist.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, keep going, Heidi.
No. I just felt like it was just empowering for me. It was great. I enjoyed that, you know, being able to take something from my past and apply it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The protagonist in my book is, it's actually based on the two women that were on either side of our house growing up. And they hated each other, you know, and they weren't friends all out. They just never had an interest in being friends. But it was from that observation of watching what went on with these two women and then going, what could have been going on?
Yeah.
You know, so pulling that initial seed from real life and going, I get to play with it, you know, I get to make them do what they want. That's good.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, you and I have spoken about this before. I mean, I definitely pull from real life. And I think that, you know, my book is about an ICU nurse whose mother asks her to euthanize her dad who has dementia. And so I've been an ICU nurse before. I have a dad with dementia, or had a dad with, I don't know how you say that. My dad had dementia before he died for 10 years. And so I definitely pulled from, you know, all of that. And I think that's kind of what you naturally do. The book that I wrote before this, like Heidi, I've got two books in a drawer. So the very first book that I wrote when I was like 25 years old was very kind of like autobiographical fiction, and really bad. And then the second book that I wrote like 100% fiction. Like I actually tried to force myself to write romance. And then it just was not a romance. It was something totally different. So I think that, you know, coming back to that, then to write about somebody that I know a lot more and that I'm a lot closer to, I think that you naturally pull in things that you know into your characters, and you naturally have this way of like, oh, this is how people feel in this kind of situation. Like you were talking about the loss of a child, or Amanda was talking about the
Mm-hmm.
loss of a child. You have those. Maybe you haven't lost a child. Maybe you know somebody who's lost a child, or you've lost someone close to you, and you're trying to, negotiate those things. And everybody who's ever been a parent has had the horrific feeling of what would I do if I lost my child. So you're able to bring in those emotions and things like that. But I think it's a weird, like, I find it very strange. And you and I talked about this on a podcast that I was on with you for a while, because
Mm-hmm.
so much of what I write is based on reality that I no longer have a connection to what that reality was. Particularly with my dad and House on Fire, I feel I have pieces of where I was like, did that actually happen, or did I make that up? Like, was that something that happened? Because some of them were so extreme, some of the things that would happen, and I'd be like, wow, did I, and I find it really interesting that lots of people connect. There's a character in my book that is 100% made up, like just not based on anybody I know or anything like that. And that'll be the character that people will identify as like, oh yeah, that's got to be your sister. And I was like, no, I don't have a sister. Like, totally not my sister. That's my 100% fictional person that I put in here to serve a purpose for the narrative. So it
Mm-hmm.
is a really interesting thing how we mix those things. And I think that's natural as a writer, that you're
Mm-hmm.
always that kind of mixing and bringing. I think even if you write sci-fi, you're bringing in what you know of relationships, or what you know of science and things like that into your writing. So
Right, right. There's that cliche of the author saying, I am not my character. People, I am not my character. And we do draw from our own lives and experiences, as we've just discussed, but then we also write what we don't know. I mean, in A Stone's Throw, one of the protagonists is a painter, and she's doing a mural installation, and I'm not a painter. I can't draw beyond a stick figure. So that entire thing was done through research. That was me being an armchair painter while I was writing this book. And I did have someone reach out and say, I'm a painter. I've done murals. And she told me I got it right, except that something that big could never be done in the time
time frame.
span within the book. And I was like, oh, I did pretty good then. All right, nice job. Because I wouldn't change the time frame. That's something I would fudge had I even been confident that, this would never happen that way, because it follows the character's pregnancy. Like, it has to happen in that time frame. So there's the creative license piece. But so what about writing what we don't know? And maybe even going into our male characters, because women's fiction, it's not all women populating our stories. Let's go there.
Yeah, so I actually have my male character has his own point of view in the story. And obviously I'm not a man, so it was a little bit harder writing from his point of view. I kind of just went with intuition, but some of it also, like, he is a Civil War vet. That took a lot of research, things like that. I think areas that I didn't know, I had to research. And by reading stories, I could uh, feel what they were feeling. And so I could write what they were feeling. Um, when it comes to falling in love or having an argument, I've been there. So I know how that feels. I know how to write that. But the things that I didn't know, I definitely had to research.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
I
And
think one of the things too is, oh, go ahead, Heidi.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think one of the things too that I've realized is that it's okay to disagree with how a character dealt with something,
Yeah.
and so you can, because a lot of, uh, especially, well, actually both books takes place anywhere from 1910 up to about 1965, and then up to 2005. But um, there's things that, okay, were Cheetos around in 1950? Those kind of things, those are the details I need to nail because they drive me nuts. But if a character does something that seems out of character, so there's a reason, I don't have to say, that doesn't really fit. As long as I give it a reason, because we don't know these people inside and out. So for me, there's some things that require a ton of research and are really important to get right. And then there's other pieces that I do have that creative place. And the little boys in my book, they're 11 years old. And I've had people reach out and say, you nailed personalities of those little boys. I grew up around all boys. There weren't a lot of girls for me to play with. So that I did draw on personal experience. But again, it was that observational experience because you can't really research how little boys act. You just kind of got to live with it, But so I think there's varying degrees of what you can research and what you just have to wing.
That's great.
Yeah. Do you try to get in? Sorry, go ahead, Heidi.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you try to get into the heads of the characters whose experience is far removed from your own. One of my historical manuscripts, at some point, I was really struggling with the father, and I knew his behavior. I knew what he had to do, and I knew why, and everything behind it was really complex, but I wound up spending a lot of time writing his journal, like journaling as him, going into his point of view, basically, and being him and writing pages and pages that would never come anywhere near the book. But I had to write them so that when he behaved on the page in a certain way, I understood what was behind it, even though the reader would only see it through the first person narrator's lens. Have any of you had that kind of experience with your characters where you're like,
it's really cool. Can I just say that's really cool?
Oh, thanks.
That's really neat. That's a great idea.
Well, so for someone, so I'm very much a plotter. Like I'm a super, super plotter. Like I'm not somebody who flies by the seat of my pants when I'm writing a book. But I'm very organic. I think more about my research and things like that. So I don't tend to, I guess I don't call it research. I'll read a book. Like I'll read somebody's book. And I'll just keep reading until I have the character. Like I know this character and I know what they're about. So I'd say something like maybe a little bit more, and that's kind of how I feel about writing too. Like you kind of take in, and then it's all of a sudden you're like, okay, I can write this now. Like I've got this information. And so like, for example, in my next book, which is called Feral Creatures of Suburbia, there's a young man who's a white supremacist. And so that is not necessarily something that I know a whole lot about, though it is based on a friend's experience with her son. So I read a book by someone, a memoir about his experiences in the white supremacist movement. And then, I read some other books that were associated with the kind of behaviors and things that this character might do. So I think that, there's different ways to approach it where I didn't feel like I had to get every little detail, right. Cause it's not like a historical fiction and it's not necessarily someone's going to be like, oh yeah, there were no Cheetos there. Because there were definitely Cheetos where my story is like lots of Cheetos. So it's not necessarily that kind of detail, but trying to get to the heart of what's going on inside that character. And I think sometimes I'm a huge fan of memoirs, so I tend to read a lot of memoirs. And in fact, Alida, I was going to say, like I meant to tell you, when I was reading your book, I told you I get sidetracked, and that's what happened. I started like right in the middle of your book. I read a memoir. I was like, bang, I'm off on a different tangent, and then I was like, wait, I got to get back to this. I got to go back to it. So I get just drawn into these stories and these very human side of people that they're sharing in memoir. And I think that's interesting now that I was talking about realism, that I'll tend to draw on memoir, right, as a source, as opposed to fiction or research or something like that. It's like that, it's that part of that human quality that we're sharing in memoir that's a little different than fiction, that I'm trying to kind of almost bring into fiction, you know.
Right.
Do you guys have a situation ever where, for example, in the first book that I wrote, there is an accident, and I'm a pantser. I'm 100% pantser. I was the kid who turned the outline in after I'd written the whole paper. And but there's often situations where I write out a scene or a chapter or, a certain segment, and not to sound crazy, but the character will come back to me and say,
Yeah.
that's not right.
Yeah.
That's not how it happened. And people are like, what, you have voices in your head? I'm like, no. But that character, you do get to know them, and you know what motivates them. You know what they have for breakfast on Tuesdays. But I like how you went and did the journaling. That's really cool.
Yeah.
But for me, a lot of times I'll pants it. I'll figure out what happens, and then I'll go back later and go, and I don't write in order either. So I might write the ending of a book because that's where the idea came. Or this day I might be feeling X emotion, so I'm going to write that portion. And then it all gets sewn together. But do any of you have that where a character will come to you and say,
Yeah.
no, you got to change this?
I can definitely relate to that because one of the male characters in my book is Noah, who's an old salty sailor, and he becomes Madeline's mentor, her spiritual mentor in the book. And I tend to spend a lot of time with my main characters researching their development, like who they are, what's their fears and desires, and what drives them, and and their flaws and their weaknesses and their strengths. But I didn't do a ton of that with Noah because he wasn't supposed to be as big as a character as he ended up being in the book. But as I started to write about him, I just fell in love with him. And he kind of came through me a little bit, where I just really enjoyed him as a mentor to her. And it just felt so easy. I researched all of the other characters really well, and I gave him the least amount of research, but he was the easiest one to write about. And I gave him more space in the book because I just adored him. And it was kind of like that. They sort of come through you and you just go for it.
Yeah, I am currently working on book 2, and I have a male character that I've really been struggling with. In order to know and I'm a pantser also. So in order to know where I'm going with him, I need to know where he comes from. So I sat down at my computer and I went full on Barbara Walters on him, asking him questions. Nothing was out. And I even found myself, seeing him, shove his fingers through his hair and leaning against his knees, like all of his mannerisms. And then a few days later, I am driving to work. I was listening to a book, but it's one of those things where being in silence, not meditating, but you're in silence because you're, like, I guess, in a meditative mode. And I'm driving to the office, and I all of a sudden hear him like, plot twist, I'm not who you think I am. And I instantly got goosebumps. So I could not wait to get back to my computer to start writing out that plot twist. So yeah, it's exciting when something like that happens.
Well, and it's funny because I always love it. The Jen and Amanda are pantsers. Heidi, are you a pantser?
I'm in between.
Okay.
I write an outline, but it's not overly detailed because I know that as soon as I get into it, I'm going to go right and left and go in different directions. So I do like a 4 or 5 page very general outline, and it's not by chapter at all. And then I spend a lot more time on the characters, their psyches, like really learning them and studying them and figuring out who they are and what they're about. That's really most of my plotting is the character development. Because again, I'll start writing a chapter and I think it's going to go in one way and it goes in another, and I just roll with it. a little bit. And I like that kind of sense of surprise. If it's a good, if I know the arc of the story, I can keep it on story, but I like it when it goes off the rails a little bit, because then it's a challenge and it can kind of get more exciting for me, and new discoveries come up and I can kind of pull it all together, and it makes it a little bit richer and deeper.
Yeah, because I mean,
find that you find those.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Dee.
Well, I was going to say you definitely, like, it's funny because I don't see those things as, like, mutually exclusive, because you all plot out the whole plot and then the character just, like, does something totally different. And you're writing and you're like, all right, I guess we're going to do that now. And I had the same experience in my new book, that, like, there was a character that was just intended to be like a momentary character, and then with having some people read it, they're like, oh, he has to come back. And he's like, I know, I feel it. Like, I wouldn't go so far as he talked to me about it, but I feel it. Like, I felt like there's something different here. Like, this character needs to be something. And it was in the storyline that I intended one way, that went a completely different way. I was like, this was going to happen. It's like totally different what actually happens. So I think it's like you're plotting, but you always have to be open to that other way that we're going to go down. It's like, oh, that's interesting, let's do that. But then I think I went back and tried to force something on a character. I was like, oh, this would be so cool, I had a dream about it, this would be so cool. And then I tried to do it and I was like, this totally does not work. Like, it doesn't actually, it broke so many other scenes that I was like, oh, this isn't going to work. Like, I'm going to have to, like, make this a totally different book, and I don't want to. So yeah.
Do you guys find that writing dialogue helps you work out pieces? Because for me, when I'm pantsing something, a lot of times when I want to know what happens, I'll have characters talk to each other, and I'll write out the dialogue. And then because that back and forth really brings out so many whys about, well, why'd you do that? Why'd you do that? And as I go back and forth between their heads, I find a lot of the story comes from that, as they're explaining things to each other, from their gut, just kind of why did you do that? I don't know. Because they're just, and they get mad about it. I don't know, but then they start working it out. So for me, dialogue is just a huge piece of the whole process.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah,
I actually do too. Yeah, yeah.
And in the second book in my series, this is part of a series, and I have a dual point of view where I have another two female characters in the second book, but the one who I just completely had her nailed down. I had all her, her profile, everything, and then about, I'd say halfway through the book, she was just like, no, that's not who I am. And I was like, wait a minute, I built you up based on these flaws and based on these desires and things, and that's not you. And so I had to struggle with that, and then I had to get to know her again as if she was a real person telling me, no, I'm not going there. I'm not going to do that. And you feel that resistance, and you just have to solve the puzzle. I don't know if anybody has ever had that experience before, but that can be enlightening and frustrating at the same time.
I think you have to go through that process of being wrong to find the right thing.
Yay! Thank you.
You really do, because you have to get past your own brain to get into the brain of a character, because you're like, this is what I want to write. This would be really cool. Like, gosh, would this be a great book? But it doesn't work, and you have to get past that barrier and get out the junk, and then go, all right, fine. What do you want to do? I don't think you can get to the meat of it without going through that casting off of what you really first wanted.
Yeah. So do you think crafting emotionally heightened scenes is crucial to the stories we're telling, whether we call them women's fiction or contemporary fiction, right? But for all of us, is that emotional component essential? And do you get to it through these characters we've been talking about, or through the moments in the plot, the key moments in the plot that shape things?
I feel like if you're in the groove, those things come through naturally, that you don't have to go, this is going to be a hugely charged scene. It's when you let go of yourself enough to listen to those characters again, to let them, to give them the reins. I think that, at least for me, I think that piece comes out naturally. Because if I sit down to say, I'm specifically going to write this, I don't think it would come through the way it needed to. I don't think I can go, I can have an idea, an overarching idea of where I want them to get to, but I really have to give them the reins and say, okay, go at it. And it might be a lot of dialogue or a lot of writing that doesn't make it into the book, kind of like your journaling. But I don't think I ever set out to make something hugely emotional with a specific intent. I think the characters get there on their own a lot for what I'm writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's funny because I worked with Jamie Attenberg on House on Fire, and I very deliberately worked on an early draft with her. It wasn't as polished as maybe somebody else would have done. I did that for a very specific reason, but she just kept. I was like the same thing. I think I'd at some point she was sending me these emails why are you doing this again? And I was walking away, and I think it's something that a lot of new writers do is walking away from the emotion, and I definitely see it at I started a literary magazine, and we just judged our first contest, and the number of stories that are not stories. They're not about the actual thing. It's the summary, and then voila, this happened, and you're whoa, wait, where did we just go? What happened? And I had a real tendency in House on Fire, and I think partially because of what it was about, of not letting those characters, not doing what Jen was saying. It was close the door, quick, we're gonna have an argument, or close the door, quick, something really emotional is gonna happen. And she and it became this thing. She was if you send me one more scene where the characters walk away from what's going on, I'm gonna be really pissed. And I was okay, I gotta look at these before I do them. So I think that's very much I think it's a very common thing for writers to do, to walk away from that. But I think if you naturally put those characters that we're all talking about knowing those characters in those situations, like Jen's saying, they naturally have the emotion. And so I don't think it's so much I turn on that emotion, is that I actually let them get to it. As opposed to avoiding the confrontation or whatever the emotion is, avoiding it. I'm actually letting it happen. I'm giving them, like she was saying, space to have that. And so I kind of certainly reading other people's stories. I see that it's more that on or off. I let them go there and have that, or I said oh my gosh, they had this big argument and it was really bad. And I keep on saying argument, but it's not necessarily an argument. It's they had this stressful experience in conversation where a lot of stuff happened that was emotional. We tend to want to close that door and oh, I don't want to write about that.
Yeah. I love what you're saying. You're so right. I see so many writers who treat their characters the way they want to be treated in real life. So it's very nice, and things don't escalate the way they could to make compelling fiction. And they do sort of, leave the scene, close the door, as you say, so that those characters don't actually come to a head. And it's almost like if we put them in the room and let things happen, as Jen was saying, the characters get there and the story goes there.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a matter.
Go ahead.
Sometimes it's a matter of they do walk away, and they're festering, and it's simmering, and like the two women in my series, that it's been almost 8 years. They hate each other. The things they do and say are ridiculous because there's so much hatred and animosity. But they've spent 8 years not dealing with it, going a different way that's easier, or, takes less personal introspection and responsibility. But sometimes it's holding off that confrontation too. And because we do that in real life, we're some people hate confrontation, others kind of crave confrontation. But sometimes it is a matter of they walk away and they won't deal with it. And that becomes part of that emotional journey and the growth piece. And that in itself could be a lot of really heightened emotional prose and dialogue and things that really pull through to, kind of the height of the story and what you're really getting at.
Yeah. I tend to write, I'm very empathic as a person. Empathy is one of my top 5 strengths and the Clifton strengths. And so I tend to want to go deep into the emotions. Like I want to go there. Like I chase after that a little bit. Like I want to hear the argument or talk or have them go through feelings of deep emotions and just, just go into that. I tend to want to create that more or want to have that in the story. And it's just a matter of me making it realistic too and not going too dramatic in it. I'm sort of the opposite where I have to pull it back a little bit and make it more real. But I think it's just because I sort of like I like to figure out the emotional swings and step into it. And I think that's just who I am as a person. And I think I'm kind of wired that way.
It was funny. Jen was just saying that about like, the characters having that. And there's a character in the new book. And I had one of the gals that read it for me first off. She's like, she just drove me nuts because she didn't do what I wanted her to do until the end. And I was like, that was kind of the point. Like, because if she did what you wanted her to do at the beginning, there would have been no book. Like it was like, but that building frustration of like, why isn't she doing this? I'm like, because it's not the end of the book. Because it's like, that's why. But I mean, there's reasons for it in the story, but you're working with that. Not you're trying to create the journey to that emotional thing that resolves.
And it's being true to that character's personality too.
Yeah.
Because you can write a fight scene, sometimes you see people, they'll write and they'll put in all these, expletives or whatever, so that there's emotion. And it's like, but if that's not true to the character. I was reading as ARC reading for somebody once, and it was this kind of fantasy dual world thing. And just out of nowhere, she threw an F-bomb in. And I was like, it just pulled me out of the story. And I was like, where did I think I actually said, where does that come from? So you have to, as you're going through all that, you still have to write it in such a way that is true to the personalities of people that are, in that conflict. And I think, when Heidi was talking about the Clifton strengths as an author group, we've been talking about Enneagrams and that kind of thing. And you had asked earlier about how do you get into the psyche of a character that isn't you. And I think that can be a good way to do it and go, okay, scientifically, we've studied, if somebody looks at something this way, then, there are patterns in their thinking. So I think there are tools for finding those if you do get stuck, if the writing itself, because I think we all get to a point where sometimes you're like, this, it's not coming out. I know what I want. It's just not coming out. So I think there's lots of tools out there. Clifton strings, Enneagrams, I think all of those are ways that we can develop characters.
Yeah. Amanda, anything you want to say about the emotional peaks in our stories, or maybe non-conflict oriented emotional peaks?
Well, I think that those emotional peaks is one of the things that makes it relatable, that makes it feel real and brings us even more into the story, gives it that depth that we need. The reasons that a book makes us laugh or makes us cry. So I think that it's very important to go with those when they come up. Just go with it. I mean, even if it's painful.
Definitely. Well, this has been so much fun. I'm glad we were able to come together and have this conversation tonight. I think so. Key takeaways: women's fiction
is good.
It's good. It's good. There are 5.
You should read it. Yes.
Books out there. Go buy them all right now. No, yeah, I think realism was a key takeaway. I really like adding that to the conversation. So it's not just strong female protagonists or books by women for women. It's this human experience, the realism of what it's like to be a functioning person in this world, no matter the genre. So even with magic realism, even in historical fiction, even in whatever. And that responsibility to detail that I think we've all touched on as we've been talking about, our responsibility to our characters, to their truths, and to what we're trying to communicate through the journey of our story. Anything else we want to add to that?
That sounded pretty good.
Yeah,
I
agree.
Well, thank you so much. This has just been a delight, and I hope you all come back to the round table soon.
Thank you, Alida.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thanks for
you.
having
Yeah.
us.
Today's Storyworks Roundtable brought together 5 amazing authors to talk about women's fiction. If you would like to know more about them and get links to their books, head over to storyworkspodcast.com. We will have the show notes, everyone's bio, and links right there in one place for you. Today's authors are D. Liebhart, House on Fire; Heidi McIntyre, Sea Magic; Amanda Speights, Love's Arrival; Jen Telger, What Heals the Heart; and me, your host, Alida Winternheimer, A Stone's Throw. My newsletter, A Room Full of Books and Pencils, is growing every week with new reflections, writing tips, and transcripts of the podcast. It's also where I make announcements about things like upcoming writing workshops and coaching sessions. Check out A Room Full of Books and Pencils at booksandpencils.substack.com. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.